Me?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, it's Danny Lozano with the Brunette Edit podcast.
Welcome back to the Brunette Edit. So I just sat and recorded a podcast that did not record for the last 45 minutes. So I am about to re-record that podcast. So what I'm going to talk about today is dealing with corporate mean girls or bullies in the workplace. And so that can look different to everybody. Not every situation is going to be the same, but what kind of inspired me to talk about this are some experiences that I've gone through. And I think it's important because going through these situations, I don't know if you're like me, but my immediate response is to see if other people have had the same experiences as me. And so that would mean me Googling or using social media to determine have other people gone through what I've gone through. And so I think that it's something that really is not talked about enough. I think that we hear people's stories about oh, I have somebody who's mean to me at work, or I've experienced somebody who's not nice, or I have, mean girls in the office. And I think it can feel a lot of times like we're in high school when you're dealing with quote unquote mean girls, and not every mean girl is a girl. In most cases, they are grown women. But I think the hard part is that this is still something that goes on every day. And a mean girl is not always a woman either. It can be a man who's making your life miserable at work too. Now, mean girl behavior in the workplace is a phenomenon, and people have been writing articles about this since 2011, if not before that. And it's something that has seemed to make shifts depending on the culture change and sociological changes of the world at the time. I would say right now is probably a really daunting time to be in the workplace, especially knowing that we've gotten, as Americans, have gotten rid of some pretty protective policies. And that can be worrisome for some people that are in the workplace. And, it's more accurately described as relational aggression or workplace incivility versus quote unquote mean girls, because, we're not supposed to call women girls. But studies show that women are often the targets of this behavior, with a significant portion of bullies, both men and women, targeting women. And so studies have suggested that 95% of working women believe they were undermined by a woman at some point in their career or have been bullied by somebody. Over 2/3 of women who bully target women, and many of the women bullied were in positions where there was an imbalance of power or power favored the bully. So in other words, either that person was senior to them or balance of the workplace favored that person in some way. So maybe the boss preferred them, or maybe they had seniority, or there are certain dynamics that made them in some way more prone to being protected. The nature of the mean girl, quote unquote mean girl, the behavior often manifests as, again, relational aggression or workplace incivility, which includes behaviors like excluding somebody from social events, personal or professional. It could be excluding them from collaborative meetings in general, not acknowledging their wins or recognition, not acknowledging them when they're being engaged with by other leadership or peers. They can treat you maybe sometimes like you don't exist, or like you're not part of the conversation that you are all engaged in. They may subtly knock you down, insult you. They can throw digs at you. They may just kind of subtly frame it in a joking sense when it really comes off hostile and backhanded. And so there's different ways how they can approach their communication with you that comes off as bullying or as mean girl. It can also include microaggressions, which are subtle. They're not really usually intentional, but harmful. And the microaggressions usually, they could or could not be conscious of them. A lot of times they've kind of already established this way of communicating with you. So as they continue to do that, they start to just naturally kind of spit microaggressions at you because it becomes easy to do, and they may not even be conscious that they're doing it at some point. And so there's different ways that bullies can present themselves. In my experience, just being in the corporate industry for going on 15 years, what I've noticed is that a lot of corporate bullies are insecure. There is a power imbalance. They find some type of boost to their ego by belittling others, which again kind of circles and points back to insecurity. And usually there's no rhyme or reason for it. I would say that mean girls or bullies usually use it as like a form of like projecting or deflection. It's not in most cases because you have done something wrong as an individual. And what some people may liken it to is something called quote unquote queen bee syndrome, which is a term that emerged in the 70s from a study of gender and promotion rates. And it also is the term used in the book that the movie Mean Girls came from. And that's what I most relate our generation to. I'm a millennial, is the Mean Girls movie. But basically it came from a study where there was a discrepancy in men and women's promotion rates. And the study was back in the 70s. And we all know that there's an inequality even to this day in the gender pay gap. But what it started to see is that there wasn't really a lot of nurturing in young female talent. And so it was creating this gap because the males were being nurtured and the females were not. And that was by both men and women in the workplace. And so they weren't really embodying the cultivation and promotion of women because it was something that was frowned upon. They wanted these men to move into positions of power. And at some point it evolved into what we know as like the high school mean girl term. And it really is something that has been geared to exploit female vulnerabilities. I don't think that the mean girl term necessarily is something that should be used in all settings, but it is something that is extremely detrimental to women. I believe young women, older women. I don't really think that there's an age gap there, but I think that it's something that is still running rampant through workplaces and most definitely the corporate world. There are studies that have been done on this. It's not something that is just, willy-nilly, like where people are just coming out with random stats and opinions on this. The International Academic Forum has done studies on mean girls in the legal workplace. LinkedIn offers advice on how to deal with toxic female coworkers. Worklife.news discusses why we still talk about mean girls at work. And then Hello Giggles, which was a blogger, also articled the mean girls trend in one of her blog posts where she interviewed about 30 women in the workplace. And so there are also labor statistics supporting that women are often bullied in the workplace. And again, it is by other women, and how important it is that we identify the behavior and call it out privately and then try to find solutions for it. People may ask, like, why are we still talking about mean girls in the workplace? And it's because it's something that is still an issue. That's why we're still talking about it. My first experience with a mean girl was a former boss that I had who didn't like me. And I'm just going to black and white say it. She did not like me. There was something about me that rubbed her the wrong way. I think that it was my subtle, sweet attitude that at the same time was not going to lie down with her aggressions. I was not going to be bullied. I was not going to be told what to do when I found that it was misaligned with like things ethically, morally, unprofessionally. And she did not like that. She was a supervisor of mine, and it was one of my first experiences with somebody who was a woman in the professional setting who just was not kind. And I worked under her for about a year. I want to say maybe it might have been 2 years. And this person just made life miserable, not just for me, but for other people. But what I think stood out to her with me was that I really didn't deal well with her microaggressions, that I really didn't lie down and kind of die where I stood like she wanted me to. And when she did start to really formally bully me, I stood up for myself, and that did not sit well with her. The final nail in the coffin with that person was she had pulled me aside to talk about, first it started as a professional matter, and we were talking about that, and then it turned into a conversation of like, well, I would hang out with you after work. And I said, well, I just don't think that's appropriate. You're my boss and I'm your subordinate. I just don't think that that would be appropriate outside of work. And I knew that that was not the case with other people. But that's what I was telling her because I didn't want to hang out with her outside of work. I knew she was a mean girl. I knew that she was nasty. I saw how she had treated other people. I saw that how she had treated people that were supposed to be her friends. And I wanted no part of it. And so that really ticked something off in her, like tremendously. And I even remember at the time when it happened, there was another person I was working with who was also my boss, and she's still my friend to this day, where she was like, I just remember this day. And I remember thinking, like, just a couple more weeks, Danielle, like, don't say anything. Just get through this and things are going to shift. Like, but I just couldn't help myself. Like, I had to stick up for myself and I wasn't going to just be shot down where I stood. And so to make a long story short, she ended up basically planting that I was non-compliant with company policies. She said that I was using the internet for personal use and I wasn't. So she had planted like quote unquote evidence. And I say quote unquote because it wasn't even true, that I had been using the computer to like browse Facebook, which wasn't even possible because I worked in a room full of people. So like somebody would have seen me using Facebook. And so I ended up leaving that company, and she ended up filing a sexual harassment lawsuit against the owner, which was unfounded because he ended up bringing in a private investigator who interviewed everybody, and all fingers pointed to that this was the most terrible person that's ever worked. Well, one of them for this company. She ended up settling out of court. And then I think after all her legal fees were paid, she ended up walking away with like less than a month salary. Like, so her attempt at being like completely evil and conniving ultimately backfired because she did not get the result that she had hoped for. Subsequently, she ended up leaving that company. I would say it was like a separation / termination. The owner didn't want her working for the company anymore when he found out, all of the things she was doing. And I don't know if it could be classified a termination just in legal terms, but yeah, she basically got let go from that position. And as far as I know, she ended up marrying a cop, and she's still a terrible, terrible person. So, it just was my first taste of mean girl culture. And she really preyed on this system where she would kind of recruit younger employees who were also women to kind of join her. And then she would lead by fear. Like, she had a best friend who was afraid of her, who also worked for her. And so it just was just a strange dynamic that she had kind of built this clique up of people who were not thinking for themselves. They would just kind of do everything that she said to do. And when they would question something, she would make them feel terrible or fearful of what the impact of that was going to be. And I just was not that kind of person. That was not going to be somebody that I was able to mold into being a little minion. And so I think it's important to outline that, a lot of workplace experts say that when women act against each other at work, they are driven by a need to compete. And that stems from what I had stated earlier, from feeling subconsciously insecure and threatened. While men can also face incivility and bullying at work, women haven't had traditional paths to power, which goes back to just when women started in the workplace, it was hell. And for a lot of time, there was no equality in the workplace. Women were not held to the same standards as men, and they didn't have to be. And so there's this, even though we're progressive and we've progressed past, like rights for women and equality in the workplace, legally, there is still this belief that you have to step on people to get to the top by women. And that's a personal view in most cases. So cutting others down is usually their attempt at trying to make themselves shine brighter. Instances of incivility or mean girl behavior might also mean excluding somebody because they're threatened. They might exclude them from social events, group messages. They might create their own little chats in Slack or Microsoft Teams. They might CC your boss on all the emails they send you. They'll send you emails pointing out your mistakes or taking measures just to subtly knock you down. So like if you're in conversations with your teammates, they may throw digs at you that are maybe other people won't pick up on, but you will. And so it's a lot of things that can kind of come into play when you're dealing with a mean girl in the workplace. Every situation is not going to look like the other. Usually our first response is to kill them with kindness and take the high road, but sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes you are a marked woman and it doesn't matter what you do, that person still has you on the chopping block. They're still going to come for you, even if you are doing your best to stay out of their way. You know, there are people that believe that the term mean girls is offensive in itself, that it's unconstructive, and it undermines that all women have campaigned to correct the terms of the gender gaps in the workplace and create this environment that's cultivating and loving and supportive and mentoring, and that we are encouraging younger females to build their careers and be successful in the workplace. And I can see why that would be. But I think also pretending like it's not a problem and it doesn't exist is detrimental to that mentality as well. If you want to grow and develop and cultivate young women, you have to also identify what the threats are and try to find solutions to those threats themselves rather than pretending like they don't exist. I think that a lot of these behaviors start in adolescence. So when you're looking back at like the shift between elementary school into junior high school, you really think about it in the sense of like the Mean Girls movie, where taking yourself back to adolescence and you're thinking, okay, like how was I in 6th grade or how was I in 7th grade? And remembering like how jarring that transition can be. And you're just kind of in fight or flight mode. You're just trying to survive as a young woman in the world going to school, and you have to be on trend and you have to be smart and you have to be cute because you want, you know, the boys or the girls to like you. And there's all these things that you have to check off all the boxes to be part of a functioning society, which we usually call junior high or high school. And that's when you start to see the patterns that create these mean girls, where a lot of times their insecurities are bred because they start at such a young age. And I know for me, looking back to junior high was the worst time of my life. I was going through terrible things at home. I had girls who bullied me, not like bullied me to where like I wanted to kill myself or like the school had to get involved, but bullied me with like snide comments and just rude things that were unnecessary and just unkind for no reason. And I look back now and I think, in my opinion, those girls bullied me because they were insecure with themselves. And I could say it probably had something to do with their appearance. And that's just my assumption. But there was something rooted in them that they were threatened by me and they felt the need to belittle me. And that's where that behavior starts. And so if it's allowed and it's continued to be allowed and there is no kind of cutting it off at the knees, then these young women will usually turn into adult women who behave the same way. And if you didn't behave that way in adolescence, you also could have learned those behaviors to carry with you into adulthood. And I wholeheartedly believe that a lot of mean girl behavior comes from insecurities. There is a wheel of emotions that you can look up on Google, and it basically will kind of tell you what every feeling is associated with on a bigger level. And so like if you can look at bullying, it's usually linked to insecurity. I know for myself, again, looking back at adolescence, I was not a mean girl. Like I didn't bully people, but I cannot without a doubt say that I wasn't mean to some people at some time. I think that when you try to fit in an environment, you surround yourself with people that are going to accept you. And if those girls are bullying, then you're going to tend to kind of, you know, go the direction they're going. And, you know, in some cases, I look back and think, I don't even know why we were mean to that girl, or I don't even know why they would say something like that. I think your intentions are to survive when they're that young. And I don't know the psychology on why young women behave that way. I think it's just trying to survive. And it's such a deep-rooted generational learned things. I think that in a lot of cases, you have young women that are being taught by their mothers, like how to respond in certain ways to the situations. And those mothers learned how to behave that way in their adolescence. And if you go back generation after generation, it's usually a learned behavior. So when do we stop teaching our young women to be mean girls? When do we teach them to be better and to be kind? And I think our generation is doing really well with that, where they are instilling in their sons and daughters that you need to be kind and you need to behave with empathy and compassion and not like little bitches. And so I think, going back into the workplace, there can be lots of things that initiate a mean girl circumstance. Again, it could be a power play. It can be an insecurity. I think power play still kind of feeds into the insecurity thing. Because in my opinion, I think that if you're secure with your position or you're secure with yourself, or you are even secure with your shortcomings, there's no reason to be mean to others. There's no reason to trample on others, to stand taller or to make your light shine brighter if you can already consciously recognize where your areas of improvement are and where your strengths are. Because if you already know that, then why do you need to trample on anybody? It's when you don't recognize those and you have a problem with them and within you that you need this opportunity to prove that you're better, that you're smarter, that you're prettier, whatever it may be. And that's when that mean girl behavior starts to exhibit itself. In 2018, researchers at the University of Arizona looked at incivility among the genders in the work, and prior studies found that women face more incivility than men. They didn't determine who it was coming from, but studies recently have shown that over 60% of women bully other women in the workplace. So women at this point have been just as conditioned as men that there is limited room at the top. So they find themselves fighting to be in those positions of power because everybody wants to be the boss at work. I think it's important for employers to understand that this is not a new problem, but it's not a problem that's being eliminated quickly. And how do you deal with the bully in the workplace? How do you deal with mean girl behavior? I think first you have to identify it. So are you really dealing with a mean girl at work? And what that would look like is it a cliquey environment? Do the women in the workplace tend to come together to form cliques like they're in high school or a sorority? Is there gossip and backstabbing? Has it gone to the point where now it's just not even talking behind your back? It's moving to a point where you're being stabbed in the back by your coworkers. They're throwing you under the bus to your boss or to your peers. Is there sabotage or withholding information? Passive aggressiveness and microaggressions? And how does it differ from normal workplace dynamics? So I've been in the corporate world for a really long time, and I've worked in retail and, I've had other jobs. So I can tell you that I've had my taste of just normal workplace dynamics. You should be able to go into a job, do your job, keep your head down, be civil with your coworkers, be constructive with them, be collaborative, go home and not think about work. That's what it should be. Your work is your livelihood. It is not your entire life. You should not go to work though and be miserable. You shouldn't have so much stress at work from a situation that it's living in your head when you clock out, to where all you're feeling is dread until you clock in the next morning. And what that can also look like is like calling out because you don't want to go into work, because you don't want to deal with these situations. Or if you're going to be a couple minutes late because there was traffic, you're calling out for the day because you don't want to deal with the situation that may come from having to call out being tardy. Usually in collaborative environments or positive work environments, you are able to collaborate with everyone. You can collaborate with women and men and your leaders. And having a good leadership team usually means that the leaders understand that, yes, they have to set an example for others. They have to be the ones that understand what the business need is at the end of the day, because without that understanding, the company's wheels wouldn't move, the gears wouldn't shift. And so the management is a really important part of why and how the company moves the way it does. But they also need to understand that there is a work-life balance and that people want to be happy at work and how to talk to people, and that being in a position of leadership does not mean that you are on a power trip. It does not mean that you are now the king of your department or your business unit. It means that you are in charge of cultivating people to run the business how it needs to be run, and to really be the overseer of not only the business development, but the people aspect of it. And so just because you're a leader, it doesn't mean that you are necessarily in charge. And I think that there is a huge misconception about what it means to be a leader. Your leader should be approachable. So in a positive work environment, your leader should have ideally an open door policy. And that's my opinion. But you should be able to approach your leaders and have conversations with them, not feel like every time they call you, it's going to be a terrible conversation, or every time they reach out to you, it's going to be because you're afraid to get fired. Like, you should have that approachable dynamic with the leader. And that is part of what makes a workplace positive. And so that's like a normal workplace. You should be able to have those working relationships that are positive and constructive and collaborative. If you look at movies like Mean Girls or Clueless, I think millennials listen to my podcast, so I'm going to stick to those. Just kind of staying on the Mean Girls topic. If you look at like the Regina George of Mean Girls, she just kind of wanted to create this environment of chaos, and she thrived on belittling people and being in a position of power. And at the end of the day, it turned out that she had some anger and aggression problems, which obviously is a mental health issue. And you look at the little sidekicks, Gretchen, Katie, and Karen. And you had one of them, Karen, who just really was not intellectually equipped to be able to understand that she was more of just like a little bit of a minion, who really just wanted to be nice to everybody, but really couldn't fully conceptualize that she was being used kind of as a weapon. And then you have Gretchen, who just wants to please. She just wants to be the people pleaser, and she doesn't know how to say no. And she just wants the person in power to be the one she confides in and be the one that she's the shoulder to cry on. And she wants to be the right-hand man to the person in power. So she's going to do everything in her power to make sure she continues to hold that spot. And so when Katie comes in, she looks at the psychological part of all of it, and she's able to pinpoint how she's going to calculate the downfall of the Mean Girls, because she is able to identify where their shortcomings are, and she knows where to kick them in the knees to make the pyramid fall. And so if you're looking at the different dynamics, there's a point in the movie where Katie does turn into a mean girl herself, because she gets so sucked into the culture and the idea that if she just is this person who these other girls are, then she's going to be able to get with the guy that she finds attractive. Well, ultimately that guy says, I liked you just who you were. You didn't need to be part of this mean girl clique. And he ends up kind of kicking her to the curb and saying, look, I don't want you if you're going to be just like the person that I was with before. And so it kind of defeats the purpose entirely when she ends up losing the guy she could have been dating. And then she loses the people that were really truly her friends, because she had kind of transformed into this other person. And if you look at the breakdown of each character, you can see how the Mean Girl clique kind of forms itself, because you have to have a queen bee, just like in a beehive, and then you have the bees. And then ultimately it takes the killing of the queen bee, hypothetically, to kill the hive, because that's what happens in nature. And so when that's done, it kind of dissolves this clique altogether until the new generation comes in and it starts all over. And so that's why, kind of going back to my point earlier, is that we need to teach our kids to do better, because this is something that really starts in adolescence, I believe, and carries into adulthood, especially knowing that not all adults can reflect and say, I'm probably going to teach my children differently than I was taught. Because you do have adults that are like, no, I'm going to teach my children the same way that I was taught. And so you are breeding these little mean girls who end up being office mean girls. And so the impact of that, in workplace culture, it does impact mental health and confidence issues for employees, peers, subordinates. It makes it very toxic to want to go to work. It makes it like where you don't want to even be in that environment. But what do you do because you have to pay your bills? What do you do because this is the worst job market in the last 10 years? What do I do when I can't go into work without crying in my car at lunch? And that's not a healthy environment to live in. It decreases productivity and morale. So if I'm thinking all day long about how I'm going to interact with somebody who's a mean girl at work, I'm not going to get anything done, because I'm so stressed about how I'm going to interact with this person. I'm so worried that as soon as I submit this project to them, or they have oversight of something that I've done, that I'm going to get an email or a Slack or a team message saying, hey, do you have a minute? And it's like, no, I don't have a minute, bitch. I don't want to talk to you. And it just starts to impede on overall morale in the workplace, which is very draining. And then it does turn into a mental health issue. It can lead to high turnover. So if this isn't something that is addressed appropriately, it causes people to quit when they say, look, I'm not going to put up with this. And high turnover is so detrimental to a company's growth and development because people that are looking for companies they want to work for do not want to work with a company with high turnover. I've worked with companies that have had high turnover and continue to have high turnover, even though I never worked there. I don't work there anymore, and I can tell you why they have high turnover. And I can tell you that that culture still has not been fixed, which is why they continue to have high turnover. People don't want to work for companies like that. Eventually, that company will fold because they're not going to have anybody that wants to work for them. And then there's gender dynamics and the stereotype of women in competition in the workplace. And so that goes back to the original argument and how the term Mean Girls came about was studying the gaps between gender and pay in the workplace. And as women, even though, again, we've closed the gap in gender inequality in the workplace, it doesn't mean that women are still not trying to claw their way to the top. And so if a woman comes in and they find that they're competing with another woman and they know what her weakness is and that she's not as assertive as them and she's not going to fight to be at the top, then they're going to use you as a stepping stone. They're going to trample all over you to get where they want to get to. And I think it's important to understand that that's part of human nature in general, but it's more rampant in women in the workplace because of the issues that we've had, I would even say to the late 90s. So there are ways to address mean girls in the office, and I think it's important to set boundaries. You need to set boundaries for yourself, even if they're just ones that you reiterate to yourself constantly. Like, no, I'm not going to allow her to speak to me that way, or I'm going to ignore that communication. I'm not going to engage in it. I'm not going to engage in side chats that are not productive. I'm not going to respond to criticism that's not constructive. And you need to set those boundaries for yourself that are professional because obviously you still have to work with that person. But setting the limit to, I'm going to tell you how you can communicate with me. And when you don't communicate with me in those ways, then there is no communication, which is completely fine. You don't have to be best friends with everybody you work with. I mean, that's not to say walk around with a chip on your shoulder and be a bitch, or walk around with a chip on your shoulder and only talk to people who you want to talk to because now you're the mean girl. But making sure you're setting those boundaries. And it kind of goes back to that quote of you have to show people how to treat you, because if you don't, then they'll just treat you however they want to. You want to avoid engagement in toxic conversation. So if you're in a group setting, maybe where this person is always quipping at you, or they're always making snide remarks, you ignore them. You don't respond to them. If they feel like if they make jokes and they think they're funny, but really they're just snotty and backhanded, you don't have to laugh at their stupid joke. You don't have to engage with them. In fact, it's probably more appropriate that you don't. And then they end up falling flat on their face. And then they find and realize that that behavior is not going to go over well with everybody else, because people don't also want to be part of that toxic culture. They don't want to sit there and listen to somebody belittle somebody else. So you're going to want to avoid any engagement in toxicity. And that includes somebody who may email you and point out your flaws and your mistakes, and you don't have to respond to them. If it's not productive of your job description or what your responsibilities are, then it's not required of you. And so let's say they do send you a snotty email and you do have to respond to it. Then you respond as constructively and appropriately as you can. And there are ways to do that, especially with new inventions like ChatGPT. You can easily tell ChatGPT, like, I have a coworker who's constantly rude to me and they sent me this email. What is the best way to respond? And ChatGPT will give you some examples of what the best professional responses would be to something like that. You want to document incidents. So make sure that you're documenting when these incidents occur. The best way to do that is to do it privately. You're not going to want to store that information on a work computer. tablet, phone. You want to do it all on your personal or private devices. Keep a notebook if that works for you. You're going to want to have the time, the date, a summary of the incident, and you'll also maybe want to put like a tag of maybe what the summary is about. For example, Brittany sent me an email and it said, you need to change the wording in this proposal. It looks like shit. And you're like, okay, I'm not going to respond to that. Or when I do respond to it, I'm going to respond to it really professionally, but make sure to document that. So your documentation would be like March 18th, 2025 at 9:50 a.m. Brittany wrote me an email that contained vulgar language and directives that were out of her, scope of responsibility. And you could even put what the email said if it's like short enough, or print out a copy of the email. And then you're going to want to put it in, like, maybe the tagline could be improper communication, so you could kind of see what the incidents tally up to. But you're going to want to keep that private. You don't want to keep that on any kind of work computer. And then a lot of people, I just want to highlight this, a lot of people think that just because somebody is mean to them at work, it means that they work in a hostile work environment. That is not accurate. So a hostile work environment in HR terms is an environment that you have a type of harassment in the workplace where an employee's work performance is interfered with by unwelcome conduct or behavior based on protected characteristics. These characteristics include race, color, religion, sex, including sexual orientations, transgender status, and pregnancy, national origin, age, 40 years and older, disability, or genetic information. It could also be inclusive of disabilities. Examples of hostile behavior would be like derogatory or offensive communication. This includes hurtful nicknames, offensive jokes, demeaning emails targeting the worker based on their personal attributes. For an example, I'm hard of hearing. I may be even considered part of the deaf hard of hearing community because I am deaf in my left ear. If I had an employee that said, or somebody who I worked with who sent me a message, maybe we're in an email and maybe we're in a meeting and I didn't hear something that was said. And then they send me a message saying, hello, can you hear? But this is like repeated and they already know that I'm hard of hearing. That could be seen as an aggression based on my disability. So it's something like that where they're targeting you because you're protected. It can be intimidating, offensive, or abusive behavior. This can include physical or mental abuse, or creating a generally intimidating atmosphere. In no environment is it okay for somebody to be abusive. So like somebody, let's say you work in an office and you have a colleague who throws a stapler at you. Like that is never okay. You have a colleague who gets upset at you and they slam your office door. Like there is certain conduct and behavior that is just not at all appropriate, even if it has nothing to do with your protected status. But in most cases, the definition of a hostile work environment is not just because they're being mean to you. And then unwelcome conduct. So this includes any behavior that is not wanted or desired by the employee. For an environment to be considered hostile, the conduct must be severe or pervasive, meaning it is frequent enough or serious enough to create an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. It is your employer and HR's department responsibility to address this timely and appropriately. And that is why it's so important to document. So you really want to make sure that you fall within these. But if an employee is just being mean to you because they think you're a bitch, unfortunately, that does not fall under the hostile work environment. So it's important to know on when to bring HR in and when to utilize the resources available to you before you reach that point. It really is your leadership's team's responsibility to promote inclusivity and team building. They want to enforce the policies and workplace bullying and then create a culture of transparency. So for me specifically as a leader, because I am a leader in the corporate world, it's important for me when there is an issue at hand that I'm transparent with kind of where I stand. I obviously have to remain pretty unbiased in most situations. But if I know that it's an issue that is inappropriate and unprofessional, it's also my responsibility to address it appropriately and not pretend like it's not happening. One of the most important things that I think leaders need to understand is that if you have an employee on your team who's toxic, whether it's a man or a woman, allowing that behavior to continue and not cutting it down and not setting boundaries and expectations immediately allows it to thrive. And when it assumes escalation and just gets out of control, that's your fault. It's not, yes, it is the employee's fault, but it's like a toddler who's never been given a timeout. If they don't understand that there's boundaries and consequences to their actions, they're going to continue to do what they've done. And whose fault is that? Because you've allowed it in the workplace. So it's important to understand that, yes, being a leader is part of, cultivating your team and being kind, compassionate, and empathetic. But also what that means too is that understanding that sometimes people may not be a fit for your team. They may not be a fit for the role or your company. And that's a tough decision to make. But allowing toxic, hostile work behavior to continue, that really is a leadership or a leadership's team's responsibility to identify and address. If you have an employee coming to you and saying, hey, I have somebody who I'm having an issue with, you need to really investigate that further and determine how you're going to attempt to find a solution to it, not listen to the employee and then pretend like it's not happening. I think it's important to also be transparent with employees and explain what won't be tolerated from the very beginning. I think that transparency is very important because it leaves no wiggle room for people to make their own assumptions. So for an example, if I have somebody starting on my team who's new as a supervisor, let's say, and I'm kind of going through the day-to-day with them, and we're talking about employee conduct and what I expect on my team, I can go through with them and tell them, obviously per company policy and per whatever the regulations are for the state, but just to explain them, I promote a constructive work environment. I expect people to work well with each other. I expect people to be kind and respectful to each other. And I don't tolerate disrespect towards me, towards your peers, towards your subordinates. You need to be respectful of people at all times. And if there ever is a situation where you're not sure how to address it, then you come and talk to me. And you can kind of leave it at that. You can elaborate it as you need. But it's really important to set the precedence for, I'm not going to tolerate any toxic behavior. So if it does reach that point, it is something that's going to be immediately dealt with, however necessary. And so, if you do find yourself either dealing with a mean girl directly at work, I think it's important for you to do what's best for you in that situation without reaching a point of escalation. You're going to want to immediately address it and not let it, fester and turn into a bigger problem before it's addressed. And I think it's important to talk to your leadership. And some people may say, my leadership is not approachable. Then you need to navigate that situation and determine what works best for the way your company dynamics are and your team dynamic, because every situation is going to be different. The only thing that I can leave as like a last resort is, if it's not a hostile work environment situation and your leadership is not helping in any way, then you need to go into kind of more of a mental warfare state to where you are only engaging with that person as needed. You're only engaging constructively, and you're remembering that every response that you give them has to be calculated, because everything that they're doing to you is calculated. And so, there's just so many ways to address it, but just knowing that it's okay to have boundaries. It's okay to stick up for yourself. And it's okay to try to find a solution to a problem, even if that means trying to talk it out with them. If you feel like you guys are two working adults and you try to find a solution where you can coexist with each other, then that's great. You don't have to be best friends. You don't have to go out for drinks. You don't have to get them a company Christmas gift. Like, all that's bullshit. But you do have to find a way to work together, because the only other option would be finding a new position, which I'm seeing a lot of the new generation is gearing to, but in the way that our job market is moving, unfortunately, I would say that's a last resort. So just some, takeaways is that the mean girl problem is a problem that continues. It's not something that just because you don't recognize it means that it's going away. I don't think it's going away anytime soon. And I think the mean girl, especially with social media, is at a high point. I think social media exacerbates everything. And I think that it allows people to be mean and nasty. That carries over into their workplace behavior, because then the lines are blurred. They don't understand that they can't behave that way in a professional setting, or they just choose not to. I think that having boundaries and being an adult about things and having that emotional maturity to say, hey, I can see what you're doing. I'm not going to tolerate it. I am going to stick up for myself, but I'm going to do it in the most professional and respectful way. And if that doesn't work, then I'm going to take the next steps to make sure that I am, protected and my job is protected, because I'm not going to continue to tolerate this. I think most people have dealt with a mean girl. If you're a woman, you've dealt with a mean girl at some point in your life, not just with work, but really anywhere. My encouragement to you would be like, just don't turn into the mean girl. Don't allow that behavior to shape and form the person that you are, and don't allow it to change your character or limit your kindness and compassion towards others, because I'm not generally a person who favors the high road, but I think in a professional setting, the high road is going to lead you to better places in most cases. And ultimately, if you find that it is not a situation that's resolving itself, sometimes finding a new opportunity is really the best thing. And you may be 100 times happier if you end up just taking that leap to a new position, which is not always easy. And I know that. I know it's easier said than done. But I invite you to send me your mean girl stories if you'd like. And if you have a really good mean girl story, feel free to send me an email if you'd like to be on my podcast. You can email me at thebrunetteedit@outlook.com. You can also follow me on all socials. I'm on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and Blue Sky Social at the Brunette Edit Podcast. And make sure to like, subscribe, and share my podcast. If you can go leave a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, I would be super, super appreciative. And that's it for next time. Until next time, bye.